pH. It fixes two problems. As it increases the amount of water we reabsorb from the filtrate in the kidneys and put back into the bloodstream. As we put more and more water back into the bloodstream, it brings blood pressure up. So low blood pressure is a stimulus. And as we put more and more water into the bloodstream, what happens to osmolarity? It goes down. So the other stimulus was high osmolarity. High blood osmolarity, low blood pressure. Those were the stimuli for ADH. Well, one of those is also a stimulus for aldosterone. Low blood pressure. Low blood pressure, through three different mechanisms that we'll cover in the urinary system, causes specialized cells in the kidneys called JG cells. Don't need to know that now. It's not on the study guide. That's how you know. To secrete renin. Renin is not a hormone. Renin is not a hormone. Renin is not a hormone. Yet on every endocrine exam, half the people listed as a hormone. Renin is not a hormone. It's an enzyme. Its job is to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, Ang1. Ang1 is going to become Ang2. We just need one more enzyme to convert it. And that's called angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. If it's not on the study guide, don't worry about it. A lot of this stuff comes up later, urinary system. So renin takes this precursor, converts it to an intermediate. Angiotensinogen becomes Ang1. And then in the presence of an enzyme called ACE, Ang1 becomes Ang2. Point being, to increase levels of Ang2, you have to release renin from the kidneys. See, ACE, that enzyme is always available. But renin, that's how we regulate production of Ang2. We can make more or less of this enzyme available. As Ang2 levels go up, aldosterone levels go up. Ang2 itself is a hormone. It does many things, 8 different actions that we'll cover when we get to the urinary system. One of them is to target zona glomerulosa and stimulate those cells to release aldosterone. Right? So yes, we can say low blood pressure is a stimulus for the secretion of aldosterone, but it's very indirect. Low blood pressure increases secretion of renin, which increases formation of Ang2, which actually targets zona glomerulosa and stimulates secretion of aldosterone. So if you look at the zona glomerulosa cells, the source of aldosterone, what type of stimulus are they receiving through this pathway? Hormonal, humoral, or neural? Hormonal. What is the hormone causing glomerulosa cells to release aldosterone? Ang2. Here's another pathway. Very simple, very direct. Zona glomerulosa cells, although they do secrete a hormone, aldosterone, that regulates both sodium and potassium, sodium levels don't seem to have much effect, not directly, on glomerulosa cells. In other words, they don't seem to be sodium sensors, but they are potassium sensors. So as potassium levels go up, zona glomerulosa cells secrete more aldosterone. Aldosterone levels go up. And now make the connection. If high blood potassium is a stimulus for aldosterone, what must be an action of aldosterone?
Decrease.
To lower blood potassium levels. By telling the kidneys to do what?
Absorb.
Reabsorb more or excrete more?
Excrete.
Excrete more. Aldosterone tells the kidneys to excrete more potassium to bring high blood potassium levels down. Here's another pathway. The main role of ACTH, corticotropin, although the name implies it affects the entire adrenal cortex. True, but its main job is fasciculata, to control the cells of zona fasciculata, the ones that release cortisol. So typically, what's causing cortisol levels to go up is an increase in ACTH. But when ACTH levels are really high, then it starts to have an effect on zona reticularis and zona glomerulosa. So when they're really high, which they will be in response to stress, that's when they not only stimulate release of cortisol, right? But this hormone also stimulates release of androgens and aldosterone. Between these two pathways, what's the minute by minute, hour by hour primary regulator of aldosterone? This pathway or this pathway? Think about how often you have a stress response, a fight or flight situation. Hopefully it's not very often. So what's the main regulator? The renin Ang2 aldosterone pathway. So aldosterone, along with ADH, is coupled to blood pressure. They are helping to regulate blood pressure. Okay, one last thing. So I talked about what aldosterone does to potassium. Okay, what about sodium? Is aldosterone telling the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium or excrete more sodium? Conserve it or get rid of it? So think about if you have low blood pressure. Would you want to put more salt back into the blood or less? Because what follows salt? Water. So what ADH is doing is just putting more water back into the blood. It's signaling these tubule cells in the kidneys to reabsorb more water, just water. Aldosterone tells these same cells to reabsorb more sodium. Well, where sodium goes, chloride follows. So salt. We're really moving salt. And as you take salt out of the filtrate and move it back into your internal environment, what follows? Water. So aldosterone and ADH work together to raise blood volume and blood pressure, bringing both salt and water back into the bloodstream. Because ultimately, if you want to keep the water in the bloodstream, the salt has to be there as well. Water's always going to follow salt. This we'll cover later when we get to long-term blood pressure regulation, cardiovascular system. I'm not going to worry about it now because it's not on the study guide. Before we move on, consequences. And I probably shouldn't spend too much time on these disorders. This is covered very thoroughly in your applications manual. And you'll notice that last page of the study guide that has all the applications manual questions. There's a lot of overlap between those questions and what's in the study guide. All right, as we go through the study guide, we're bringing up disorders again and again. What happens when there's too much of this hormone? What happens when there's too little? That's 90% of what the applications manual is covering. Okay, so those questions at the end really aren't additional to what we're covering in the study guide. Right? It's a lot of overlap, a lot of the same stuff. But just quickly, if aldosterone signals the kidneys to conserve salt and therefore water, what's going to happen if there's too much aldosterone? Hyperaldosteronism.
High blood pressure.
High blood volume and therefore high blood pressure. With Addison's disease, you're suffering from both low levels of mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids, but just focusing on the mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. What happens if there's not enough? Low blood volume, low blood pressure. Okay, but we're just addressing sodium and the connection between sodium and water. What about potassium? If you have hyperaldosteronism, What are blood potassium levels likely to look like? Too high or too low? If you have too much aldosterone, you're going to get rid of too much potassium, ending up with hypokalemia, low blood potassium. And if there's not enough aldosterone, hyposecretion of aldosterone, what can that lead to? Because we rely on aldosterone to regulate the excretion of potassium. So if we're not excreting enough potassium, and you continue to eat potassium-rich foods, what's going to happen?
Too much.
Hyperkalemia.
I was wondering if the aldosterone regulates the minerals and potassium. Would an imbalance cause an imbalance of like muscle contraction and chemical like nerve signals?
Absolutely. So if you start looking at consequences of too much or too little aldosterone, and in turn too much or too little sodium or potassium in the blood, that leads to you have electrolyte imbalances, and it affects the heart, it affects the nervous system, skeletal muscle. Yeah. So you can make neurons and muscle cells hyperexcitable or hypoexcitable. Like, for example, too much potassium can basically stop the heart. That's one way to arrest the heart, a hyperkalemic solution. Put the heart in a hyperkalemic solution, it stops. Zona fasciculata. Group name for the hormones coming from zona fasciculata? Glucocorticoids. Primary? Cortisol. Stimuli. Stress, hypoglycemia. What was this also a stimulus for, mentioned previously? Growth hormone. And you'll also see that it's going to be the same stimulus for catecholamines. And sure enough, what does growth hormone and cortisol and the catecholamines all do collectively? What do they all have in common? Hypoglycemia is a stimulus. They all increase blood glucose levels. So again, you have a group of hormones that can bring blood nutrient levels, not just glucose, but all nutrients, can bring blood nutrient levels up when they're too low. But unfortunately, only one hormone that can take high blood nutrient levels and bring it down. And that one hormone is insulin. So you've got your three hormone pathway: corticotropin releasing hormone, adrenocorticotropin, cortisol. Cortisol levels go up, negative feedback to the pituitary, the hypothalamus. We mentioned last week that the circadian rhythm influences many hormones, including melatonin and cortisol. So remember, circadian rhythm is essentially changing the set point, causing cortisol levels to go up and down, to fluctuate over a 24-hour cycle. Hormone actions. Stimulates proteolysis and gluconeogenesis to increase blood glucose levels. Those two things actually go together. With gluconeogenesis, what are you making glucose from? Non-carbohydrate sources like fatty acids or amino acids. Do you see the connection? Where are you going to get amino acids from? Breaking down proteins. Proteolysis. Gluconeogenesis. They go together. So you're stimulating proteins, mainly from muscle, unfortunately, to break down, releasing amino acids into the blood, and then you're basically telling the liver, take up those amino acids and make glucose with it. This is how people that do the low-carb, no-carb diets, which are very dangerous, this is how they're making glucose, which the nervous system absolutely needs. But unfortunately, you typically can't make enough glucose to support metabolic demands of the body simply through gluconeogenesis. So the liver also makes a lot of the alternative fuel, ketones, keto acids, right? And that's where the low carb, no carb diet can lead to ketoacidosis. You're basically putting yourself into a starvation state. Right? You're not starving for all nutrients. You're starving for the primary fuel that the body relies on, especially the nervous system, and that's glucose.
So does that mean that like a high stress environment, like a high anxiety, can release extra cortisol, which can break down skeletal muscle, so
Sure.
it can lead to muscle loss?
Absolutely. And so a big fear of athletes, bodybuilders who are trying to increase muscle mass is cortisol. So there's all these anti-cortisol supplements out there that minimize either the production of cortisol or the actions of cortisol at the target cells. So yeah, it's a catabolic hormone, right? So if you want to get big muscles, you're looking for anabolic actions, not catabolic. Adipose breaks down lipids.
Is that why the low carb, no carb diets always have really high protein? Is that what they're trying to replace?
Yeah, because right, you've got to get your calories from somewhere, and you have three choices: proteins, fats, carbs. So you're getting that half from protein, half from lipid, and none from carb if you're really doing like a no carb diet.
Can they successfully do it if they have enough protein in their diet? Or is there still going to be
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Some people can tolerate it, but a lot of people can't. Lethargic, headaches, mood swings. Yeah. Because again, you're putting yourself into a starvation state. And it's not that you don't have any fuels. The fuels that you're making to replace the glucose, the keto acids, can lead to ketoacidosis. Why is lipolysis a glucose-sparing effect? And by the way, just another reminder of this. This is why you can't memorize physiology. You have to understand it. Don't even attempt to memorize this stuff. And that's why I ask so many questions during lecture. These are the exact questions you should be asking yourself if you really want to understand this and be able to talk about it and answer questions about it. So you shouldn't memorize that lipolysis is a glucose-sparing effect. You should understand why it's considered a glucose-sparing effect. By doing what?
Creating new.
So you're providing the body, primarily muscle, with an alternative fuel to spare the glucose for the brain. Glucose-sparing effect.
What's FFA?
Free fatty acid.
So you're breaking down lipids to get the fatty acids, which raise glucose level.
So the fatty acids get into the blood, and muscle takes up those fatty acids and makes ATP with it instead of using glucose. And that saves the glucose for the nervous system. And sure, if you're providing muscle, which accounts for many people, 30-40% of your total body mass, we've got a lot of skeletal muscle in there. If you're giving it an alternative fuel, that can help increase blood glucose levels, right? Simply because the muscle's not using glucose, it's using this alternative. So yeah, it spares the glucose. It helps us keep those blood glucose levels elevated, or at least in the normal range. Turns out high levels of glucocorticoids produce anti-inflammatory effects. They basically not completely inhibit, but they inhibit somewhat the immune response. Right, so in high levels, glucocorticoids are immunosuppressives. This is why we give glucocorticoids to people who have transplants, kidney transplant, for example. Right? Because if you put somebody else's cells in your body, your immune system is going to view those cells as foreign, and your immune cells will attack it. Well, how do you prevent that? Immunosuppressives. Yeah. Anyone know what some of those common immunosuppressives are, or glucocorticoids? Starts with a P. It's very common. If you have a really, really bad like respiratory infection, autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, for example. Prednisone. It's a glucocorticoid. What do you put on your skin for inflammation of the skin? Cortisone cream? It's a glucocorticoid. hydrocortisone, cortisone, cortisol, prednisone, they're all glucocorticoids. During a stress response, do you want your immune system devoting effort and energy into fighting infection? Or should we be using that energy for something else? Getting away from the threat, the tiger, right? So does it make sense then that during fight or flight, when cortisol levels are really high, the stress hormone, that they are high so that we can suppress the immune system? Absolutely, makes perfect sense. You ever heard that being stressed can cause you to get sick more easily? Do you see why now? You're stressed, cortisol levels are high, immunosuppressive effects, higher risk for infection. And lastly, cortisol, like thyroid hormone, is permissive for catecholamines. So you have to have both. Thyroid hormone in normal concentrations, cortisol in normal concentrations for the catecholamines to do their normal job. So if you have hypersecretion of cortisol, what tends to happen to heart rate, blood pressure? Tends to be high. Even without releasing extra catecholamines, their actions are going to be stronger because of that permissive effect of cortisol. So when you're stressed, that is one reason why your heart rate tends to be elevated, blood pressure tends to be high, and people that are hypertensive are told to reduce stress for that reason, to keep the stress hormones down. Cortisol being the main stress hormone, or at least that's what we tend to think of it as, but catecholamines, right, just as important. They are very much part of that stress response. In fact, they're phase one. Before cortisol, being a steroid, even does its thing, because it takes a while to see the actions of a steroid. Catecholamines get the ball rolling.
This highlighted green box, is that on the lab? What does that have to do with that?
It's kind of for me. So when I pull this up as we go through this stuff, this is kind of what I want to focus on in the moment. Doesn't mean there's other stuff here you don't need to know. Certainly there is.
Saying what is it, since doesn't the lab up top?
Right, there's no lab stamp, so this won't have anything to do with the lab exam. So this is just a reminder for me, I guess for you in part. This is what we're focusing on right now when I bring up this slide. We're looking at the actions, talking about the actions.
Professor Moore?
Yeah.
For cortisol, does it depend on your genetic makeup, or because when people say
The answer is yes. Everything depends on your genetic makeup, but
everybody says stop stressing as much, you know what I mean? And that's
You're like, yeah, right.
where it's easier said than done. But you know, I'm sure a lot of people are under stress, but their levels of cortisol affects their body differently.
absolutely.
So, but how do you kind of narrow down besides physical appearance when you start seeing cortisol? You see all the commercials, cortisol.
Sure.
But how do you, for yourself, figure out?
You can't rely on physical changes.
Okay.
You've got to go have the blood drawn.
Oh, and they can tell you.
You've got to see what cortisol levels are looking like, your
Okay.
baseline levels. And they may check you at different times of the day. But that's the only way to know for sure, because there's so many other things that could cause physical changes.
And is that important to know, like, unless you're, okay, that's.
No, I've never heard of a situation where someone who's got issues associated with stress, like high blood pressure, having to have their cortisol levels checked.
Okay.
But if there are anti-cortisol supplements out there that are effective, I can certainly see a physician prescribing those, or at least suggesting them. Yeah. Physicians don't prescribe non-FDA approved supplements, but they may suggest. They can't prescribe it. If you see, a homeopathic, holistic type of person, they may certainly prescribe that to you. This next part is connected to the physio-X assignment because they asked you similar questions, and that was differentiating between Cushing's disease and Cushing's syndrome. And there's a nice slide that really shows what's going on. High cortisol because of high ACTH. Most likely cause of the high ACTH, tumor. If the reason for the high cortisol is high ACTH, we call it Cushing's disease. If ACTH is fine, and you have high cortisol levels anyway, most likely there's a tumor in the adrenal gland responsible for all that cortisol. That's Cushing's syndrome. So, if it's primary hypersecretion of cortisol, it is considered Cushing's syndrome. If it is secondary hypersecretion of cortisol, it's considered Cushing's disease. And then there's another possibility. I think they call it idiopathic or physicians-induced hypercortisolism. And think about that name, physician-induced. What could the physician be prescribing you that is causing the symptoms, the signs and symptoms of too much cortisol? Glucocorticoids, like as immunosuppressives, like prednisone. So that's why prednisone is tough. There's lots of side effects, a lot of negative side effects. Many people don't tolerate prednisone very well. Physicians don't like to give it to you over an extended period of time if they don't absolutely have to. Because it can present the same signs and symptoms as you would see if you had hypersecretion of cortisol. So there's really three possibilities: Cushing's disease, Cushing's syndrome, or physician-induced hypercortisolism. Although cortisol isn't the culprit, it's the prednisone, which acts just like cortisol. Body can't tell the difference. As far as the body's concerned, a glucocorticoid is a glucocorticoid. Consequence of too much cortisol. Right? Regardless of the cause, whether it's syndrome or disease. If you know what cortisol does, it stimulates proteolysis, stimulates lipolysis, stimulates gluconeogenesis. Then you can figure out the consequence of too much. If you have too much lipolysis, what's going to happen?
Low blood.
High blood fatty acid levels and excessive breakdown of fat. Now that might sound enticing, but here's the problem. If you don't use energy, it just gets stored somewhere else, right? You can't lose it. You have to use it. If you're breaking down all these fatty acids and you're not actually using them as an energy source, they're just going to get stored as fat somewhere else. So really what you end up with is redistribution of fat in really strange places, right? And one of them is described as the buffalo hump, right on the upper back, lower neck. Big mound of fat right there.
Yeah.
That's one consequence of hypersecretion of cortisol. So look at the symptoms. Glucose excess, right? Too much gluconeogenesis, high blood glucose. Protein shortage, right? Because of proteolysis, too much proteolysis. Abnormal fat distribution from all the lipolysis that's going on, but then not being able to use that energy as quickly as you're putting it into the blood, so it gets restored somewhere else. I think belly and the buffalo hump are the two main locations. And that's why you've seen commercials, Cortislim, I think, and others. They're really targeting the belly fat. That's what they're focusing on. It's going to help with the belly fat. Addison's disease, you have two problems: deficient aldosterone and deficient cortisol. So focusing on deficient cortisol, what would you expect to see? So remember, cortisol stimulates gluconeogenesis. So if there's not enough gluconeogenesis going on, you might have hypoglycemia. Okay. What else? If you're looking at aldosterone, insufficient aldosterone, yeah, low blood pressure. If you don't have enough aldosterone, are you getting rid of too much sodium? or retaining too much sodium.
Retaining.
So we rely on aldosterone to get rid of potassium and keep sodium. So if you don't have enough aldosterone, what's going to happen to sodium? You're going to lose it. Hyponatremia. Natremia, Na, that's sodium. That's low sodium levels in the blood, hyponatremia. Well, if you have low sodium, you're going to have low salt. If you have low salt content in the blood, you're going to have low water content, a low blood volume. And if you have a low blood volume, you're going to have so hypotension. And then focus on potassium. We rely on aldosterone to excrete potassium when the levels are starting to go up in the blood. So if you don't have enough aldosterone, what can happen?
Too much potassium.
Too much potassium, hyperkalemia, right? K, that's the letter or the symbol for potassium. When you're studying, this is how you study. You break it down, you see the connections, look for relationships, understand what's going on. Don't even attempt to memorize this stuff. If you understand it, you're not going to forget it. Now you need to go over it several times just to get it from short-term to long-term memory so that you retain it, you know, a week from now, 2 weeks from now. But understanding is the key. So we'll pick it up next time with zona reticularis.